fellow travelers. Welcome to the 20th level of the RPG Cave. I am one of your hosts, the level 99 human archmage, Ryan Turf, and I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf ranger, Mr. Garret Blend. Garret, how are you doing today on this lovely, lovely Sunday?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm doing good. I have, of course, my second cup of coffee.
Of course.
As every episode, this is probably a routine now. As I do with one beer with Nintendo Shack, I do my second cup of coffee with the RPG Cave. So,
and of course, just letting people behind the veil a little bit, we've changed our record time that we normally record the show from Saturday, mornings to like Sunday afternoons. And you know what? It doesn't matter because you end up with the second cup of coffee regardless of what time we record this show.
It gives me a good reason. It's like, all right, I got to be prepped, ready to go and talk about this podcast. I need a drink. And of course, I'm not going to have a literal alcoholic drink in the middle of the day. So I'll just get some coffee.
That's crazy
and
talk
be good.
There. That's crazy talk right there. But of course, this is the RPG Cave where we talk about RPGs. So let's clear the dungeon before we get into the proceedings. If you want to support our show and you like what we do, of course, there's a number of awesome ways you can do that. Number one, you can support us right here on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, the video version of the show, and you're seeing our beautiful faces right now, you can subscribe, like, share, all that stuff over on youtube.com/YumiCapri. Also, you can subscribe to us on your podcast feed of choice. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. We're on all the things, so you can check us out on your podcast service of choice. And if you leave a review on Apple Podcasts, we'll read it on the show. And last but not least, if you want to, throw a little tip in the old tip jar, patreon.com is how you do that. So patreon.com/YumiCapri. You get a little bit of early access to this and all of our shows, as well as exclusive content, like a new episode of the Yumi Capri podcast, which we put up this week. So you can definitely check out all that stuff there. Well, now let's read from the sacred text, Garret, and talk about our big topic this week. So this topic was actually inspired by a fan of the show, a listener. So, we actually always throw it out of our questions, but Marcus O'Neill 79 on Discord had asked us a question on one of the shows a few weeks back. I think it was the episode that we did with Fire Emblem, and he actually asked a question at the same time that he was like, "Hey, this would make a great topic for the show that I'd love to hear." So, going back to Marcus O'Neill's question that he asked, he said, "As someone who loves RPGs but is realizing he has played disappointingly few of them, I was hoping you could give me a short list of your essential RPGs in quotations, kind of like Garret and Ryan's list of RPGs that every RPG fan should play." So what I decided to do with this question is basically kind of morph it into, because even though we had talked about how we got into RPGs on our very first episode, and we do talk about, when we talk about a specific series, kind of where to start, we haven't really done like a starter's guide almost for people that are new to RPGs that are really trying to find, where they should get started with the genre in general. So rather than doing it from the perspective of essential games for every RPG fan should play, assuming that you already are an RPG fan, it's tough to gauge, of course, with an RPG fan where everyone's kind of starting from. So I figured it would be better to approach this from the perspective of what new people to RPGs should approach it from. Just because, again, as someone who's an RPG fan already, there might have been some of the games we're going to talk about today that you might have already played. And I mean, it'd be hard for us to kind of factor a lot of that into kind of the suggestions we have for that. So what we did, Garret and I each came up with 5 suggestions, but we didn't talk about it ahead of time. So I did bring some extras in case we've got some overlap here. I got some
extras as well.
And we're going to kind of publish this list on Discord. We're going to post it there as well as on Twitter after the show goes live, so people can kind of get the sense of, where we as, longtime RPG players think you should actually get a start. So we're going to kind of go back and forth and kind of go one pick each. So Garret, would you like to go first or second?
I can go first.
Sure.
And let me tell you, Ryan, this list, it was very hard to really bog down to the games I should suggest versus the games that I really enjoyed, or my favorite games in certain series. So I need to from a level standpoint of who's going into RPGs and what's the start of it, what's the best place to be at.
Well, not only that too, but you also kind of have to factor in modern playability and how well it plays today, because you don't want to recommend something that, even though we probably are more attached to it from the past, if it doesn't hold up well and someone's going to play it for 5 minutes and put it down, that's not what we want to have here. So
yes. I think we have a few games that are in common. So I'm going to start with a game I think we'll both agree on this. And I actually played it this year, and I do think this game is probably essential to any JRPG person that wants to get into that genre, and that is Chrono Trigger. Yes. I think that game, from the start to the finish, it's one of the best RPGs that you can think of. There's really no negatives about it. I love the battle system and the companions that you go along the way. The pixel art and from the SNES era still holds up to today. I mean, and the music is just fantastic. I think just everything about this game is the pinnacle of JRPGs, classic JRPGs. So yeah, that's my first pick.
That's a really good pick. And plus we did a whole episode of Chrono Trigger. So if you want to get kind of our in-depth thoughts about Chrono Trigger, and we did it kind of in a non-spoilery way too. So if you're someone who's maybe new to RPGs or maybe hasn't played Chrono Trigger before, especially like you, Garrett, who just played it for the first time this year, go back to and listen to that episode if you want to kind of learn kind of what our full thoughts are. And this was a game that was on my list. So you did kind of expect that. Because what I did with my list is I basically broke them into specific categories that I feel like, every person who's new to JRPGs should actually, establish. And I think one of the important categories to talk about, which is where I had Chrono Trigger filed, was a Super Nintendo RPG. Because I think that the Super Nintendo was a console that not only has incredible games on it, but incredible games that hold up really well today for anyone who's never played them. And not only that, but it was a big renaissance for RPGs just in general, that console. So I think that it was one of the central eras, if you want to kind of understand RPGs, knowing the history of the Super Nintendo and RPGs that appeared on that platform. And Chrono Trigger easily would be my pick from that console too. So I think that one we can both agree with. Just like I think we might agree on this one, although I know we're going to agree on the franchise, but I don't know if we're going to necessarily agree on the same game. But one of the other categories I'd had here is I think that every person who's new to JRPGs, even though action RPGs are more of the flavor of present day games, I feel like every person who's new to JRPGs should play a turn-based RPG at some point. Yes. And don't get me wrong, Chrono Trigger is one that fits this, but I think one that is probably the most beginner-friendly turn-based JRPG is Persona 4 Golden on the PlayStation Vita or PC. Yeah. And normally I might have stopped myself and say Persona 5 because I personally am more invested in, and I love Persona 5 more, but I think, and we talked about this on the Persona episode, but I think Persona 4 Golden is less of a time investment for a new player who wants to kind of get into these types of games. Not only that, but I think it's kind of the pinnacle of, modern turn-based JRPGs as far as the combat is concerned, as far as the storytelling is concerned. And it's just a really impressive game that still really holds up all these years later, even though, again, it originally appeared on the PS2, the Vita version, and the PC version obviously is the version to play. But I would say Persona 4 Golden is my first addition to the list, and is a no-brainer, I think, for people who are new to JRPGs. Like, I think it's a really good way of getting into, like, turn-based JRPGs. And I know for a lot of people it's really worked on them too. But what do you think? Did you have Persona 4 Golden on your list, Garrett, somewhere?
I did have a Persona game, but it was Persona 5 for sure. I think Persona 4 Golden's a very good choice, though, because that was the first game that got me into the franchise as well. And if you're going into the JRPGs, if you're patient enough, I think Persona 4 Golden's an absolute treat. And it is a smaller time commitment. I do prefer the characters in that game versus Persona 5. Granted, Persona 5, it has a lot more style, probably a little bit more quality of life improvements, but it is a lot longer time to invest in, especially Persona 5 Royal, where
it's
they just
one of the longest
6
modern
months or
games,
something.
Period.
Yeah, so. I'm sure it's going to be a slog to a lot of people that is like going into it's like, oh man, I'm going to have to play this 150-hour game. It's like, that's kind of rough. So I agree with Persona 4 Golden. That's a good choice. So
nice. So Garrett, what's your second pick on this list?
Okay, let's depart a little bit from the JRPGs. I'll go back to it. There is certainly another game I want to add in there, but let's go to the Western RPGs. I know we'll need to grab at least a couple of them, or at least one out of that category. And I I really love this company and this franchise itself, and I'm glad that they were able to give the opportunity to do it, and that is Fallout New Vegas. Ooh. I love Obsidian. I love the Fallout franchise, and I think Fallout New Vegas is the best Fallout game in the franchise itself. I think it does a really good job of player agency and choice, but with that Fallout kind of like exploration, but also just like feel deserted. But at the same time, you have companions with you, quest lines that extend far out. I think, I think Fallout New Vegas should be one of the essential RPGs that everyone should play.
Yeah.
And it has like 6 different endings. And you can go good or bad. You can go straight in the middle. And I don't know. It was really fun.
Yeah. So. Of the Fallout games, I think you're probably spot on with that one, because Fallout 4, even though I think it has some quality of life improvements, like the mandatory base building and stuff, I think it was a big turnoff for people.
Yeah.
And just the story I don't think is nearly as good as either Fallout 3 or New Vegas. Yes. And I think that New Vegas, it just had the added benefit of coming out after Fallout 3 and having a little more quality improvements to it. Although I will say that with New Vegas, the one problem you do run into, unless you play on the PC version, is if you play a console version of it, the bugs and performance of that game are hit and miss. If you put on the cowboy hat, for example, the famous cowboy hat, if you put it on at the wrong time, it totally breaks the game. You have to start the game over again.
I didn't know that.
There are certain little quirks and game-breaking bugs that just never got patched with the console version. Whereas on the PC version, it got a lot more support. There's a lot more mods for it. So you don't run into the same problem. So I would say if you're going to definitely check it out, play it on PC, and plus, any modern PC can play it. So
yeah, it's it's an old game and it's highly optimized for PC. So just go and play over there.
Yeah, if you're gonna jump into New Vegas at all, which I think, again, to your point, I think it's great for newcomers to both Fallout and for Western RPGs. So that's a good pick. And speaking of Western RPGs, I might as well give my Western RPG pick, because I did have a Western RPG category, because I think every RPG person who's new to RPGs should play a Western RPG of some kind. And I actually chose one that actually came out this year, but it's not a game that released this year. It was a collection that released this year. Mass Effect Legendary Edition. I cheated a little bit.
Yes.
Mainly because I think of the Mass Effect trilogy as one game that just happens to have been released alongside 3 games. But Mass Effect Legendary Edition is kind of the pinnacle of all 3 of the Mass Effect games, from all of the great improvements they did to 1, to how good 2 still holds up all these years later, to even 3, which I know people were disappointed with the ending for Mass Effect 3. But for me, when I first played it, it didn't really bug me too much. But knowing that the extended cut, for example, is built into the ending now and whatnot, I feel like it's a really solid bang for your buck title of 3 really solid games that really, again, you just think of as one game, because your save progresses all the way through all 3 games. Your choices matter across all 3 games. And really, it just feels like one really coherent story, similar to how I feel about kind of Golden Sun and Golden Sun The Lost Age, because it kind of works the same way. So I think of them as one release, which is why I qualify them as one release for this list. So not only that, but I think it's one of the best modern action RPGs. It's got a fantastic story, great characters, and really interesting world. And I know a lot of people really got into RPGs because of Mass Effect. So I know it's a really beginner-friendly RPG. So definitely check out Mass Effect Legendary Edition that came out this year.
I need to check that out. Unfortunately, that's been a big gap in my gaming repertoire for a while now, but I think probably the holidays, once it's like down a little bit more, I think I'll definitely get into it, especially when I get a lot more free time. I definitely want to hit the Mass Effect trilogy pretty closely. So.
Yeah, it's a series that I think you'd really like, Garrett. So yeah, I can't wait to hear what you think about it when you finally get a chance to play it. Especially because, again, like, this is the real way to get into it. Because before Legendary Edition, I might have just said to wait, or maybe even skip Mass Effect 1. As much as I love the story in that game, the gameplay is just, it hurts to go back to for a new player. But now with everything they've done to kind of improve that first game and make it modern playable, I think now it's in a really good place for beginners, for sure.
Nice. All right, so my next game is actually a very beginner RPG type of game, and it's going to be in the more tactical, turn-based, cover-based RPG area, and I think I see another listener actually put out this in their list, and I'm glad they did. And that's Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. That is one of my favorite XCOM-like games. I think it's very nice and very easy towards people who want to get into this genre. I think it's fun and like it has a very nice style to it, and I love the Rabbids and the Mario humor into it. It's not necessarily too difficult. They ease you in pretty well, but it does get challenging, and you can make it challenging yourself. So I really enjoy this game. I love the level design in this and made it their own identity with it. And I absolutely love the DLC as well. The Donkey Kong DLC should have been its own game. Yeah. And it's just a very nice style with it. So yeah, that's my next pick. That's Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. Yeah. Anything else to say about that, Ryan?
Well, I mean, it's awesome, first of all, that we have a sequel coming out fairly soon for it. And I will say one thing about Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle is that it can be a little difficult, but at the same time, it's nowhere near as difficult as, you know, XCOM 2 or something like as anything else made by Firaxis. So, yeah, I think that's actually a really good pick, especially considering I also had a strategy RPG on my list that I'm going to actually get to in a second. But I actually think that it's a great place to start, especially it being a Mario game in particular. Like, of course, like every Mario game is designed with, you know, the playability, assuming that it's someone new to gaming or new to the genre coming into it for the first time. So I definitely think it eases you into the genre a little bit in a lot of really interesting ways. And yeah, you're right about the DLC too. I think the DLC was great for that game. And yeah, really good game that I did not nearly expect to be as good when we first saw it. Like when we first saw the characters and the design, I'm like, I don't know about this game. But then the second we saw that gameplay, I was like, oh crap, I know this is going to be fun. Like I know this is going to be awesome. So yeah, I'm glad that you actually had that on there. And I think Blaze Knight actually had that on his list, but we're going to talk about those lists in a little bit. I also agree with you, Garrett. I think that every RPG fan or everyone who's new to RPGs should play a strategy role-playing game of some kind. And we actually talked about this one a couple weeks ago, so it's actually pretty recent in my mind. But Fire Emblem Awakening is my pick for a strategy RPG. And we talked about this when we were debating kind of where Fire Emblem fans should maybe start with the games. And I think that, and I said this back on that episode too, but I feel like it's a better beginner RPG than, say, Fire Emblem Three Houses, even though it's on 3DS versus Three Houses, which is on Switch. I think that it's easier to get in because it's a lot more streamlined than Three Houses. It doesn't have a lot of the clutter of going around the monastery and talking to people and doing all the extra stuff that you have to do outside of the battles in that game, where I think that can be a little overwhelming for some people who are new to the strategy role-playing genre. And it's streamlined in the same way that Mario plus Rabbids is, where I think that
it is,
you pretty much, it's a very linear game, but at the same time, you can backtrack and kind of grind if you feel that you're not quite powerful enough to go into it. You don't have to play with permadeath if you don't want to. If you're a new player and you just want to experience the story, which, speaking of the story is fantastic in Awakening.
It's really good,
It's really well written, and the voice acting is great. It's got some great cinematics, and overall, it's one of my favorite 3DS games, and I think it's a great place for people to start with strategy role-playing games for sure. So Fire Emblem Awakening is my pick for my third slot. Back to you. What do you think about this?
I definitely agree. Fire Emblem Awakening was in my list. You actually convinced me from Three Houses to Awakening once you started playing. It was talking about it more and more. It reminded me my journey throughout this game. I need to replay it. I need to replay it and go through it again and remind myself how good that game is, because I think it's still the best Fire Emblem I've played of the latest Fire Emblem series. So great pick. I definitely agree with that.
Nice.
All right. So I have two more choices, right?
Yep. Two more.
Oh, man.
We're getting down to brass tacks.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I think I've narrowed it down. So let me talk about this next game. We'll go back to the JRPGs and a very starter RPG type of realm as well. And I think Pokemon needs to be in this list.
Yep.
Just because I think most people that got into JRPGs may have started with Pokemon as their first game, as
like
their first
Garrett.
baby RPG. Like me. Exactly. I started when I was like 4 or 5 years old, Pokemon Yellow. But I think I chose probably one of the better additions for an intro RPG person. I think it packs a lot of content versus a lot of others. But it's not necessarily a new one. So I chose Pokemon Soul Silver and Heart Gold.
Okay.
So that is the remake of the second gen Pokemon series. And the reason why I picked that is because I think it's probably, it has already a ton of Pokemon in there that you can kind of handle. And it's a lot of content in there. You can go through the Johto region and then back to the Kanto region as well. So you got a lot of hour count in there. I think they did a lot of great quality of life things in that edition versus others. And, you know, I mean, the story is not too overly complex like these. Well, kind of like Pokemon White and Black and then further on. And I didn't, it's Sword and Shield left a bitter taste with the story and everything. And I think it's just a good balance in this game overall. I think it has a great Pokemon kind of like repertoire in there. So yeah, I'm going with Soul Silver and Heart Gold.
Nice.
With Pokemon series.
And that's the thing. I also had Pokemon on this list, but I was like really struggling to figure out which Pokemon game to recommend because as much as I love the older era of Pokemon games, they are a lot harder to get into and a lot less accessible than I think some of the newer Pokemon games were. But I didn't want to recommend Sword and Shield or Let's Go either, even though I do think maybe Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu is probably like the most beginner friendly Pokemon game you could have. But also too, we're recording this, you know, a couple months before Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl come out too. And those, like, maybe with the quality of life improvements might be better. Although again, I haven't played the original versions of those games, so I don't know how those compare to Soul Silver and Heart Gold, especially because I'm like,
oh, they're great.
Okay, because Pokemon's kind of a blind spot for me. I don't play a ton of the Pokemon games. I don't play them every time they come out, but I do like them. It's just one of those things where we get one every year, so it's kind of hard for me to justify buying, you know, each new Pokemon release every year. So I'm a bit behind on Pokemon, but I am excited to play Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl this year, though. Like that's a game
I'm very excited for the Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, most than I have in a long time, ever since probably the third gen remakes. Maybe I'm just an old school Pokemon fan now because I haven't really liked the newer ones, at least the past 3 gens. So I'm very excited to go back into this Gen 4 and seeing it being in Chibi version and the art style. I was just like, thank you for going back to that. It looks really nice. So
I mean, I think you and I are just both old fogies, you know, Garrett. I was going to recommend, you know,
old curmudgeons.
Pokemon Blue and Red, and just be like, yeah, just go pull out your Game Boy and play Pokemon Blue and Red. But obviously, that's probably not the best answer for people to go back and play nowadays. So yeah, so there you go. So Pokemon, we knew it had to be on this list. I mean, it's the most beginner-friendly franchise in RPGs out there, so we had to have that in here. Well, we haven't really talked a lot about action RPGs on this list, Garrett. We've had a couple, but for the most part, we really haven't had any. So I wanted to bring one in here. Now, again, coming up with action RPGs was a bit difficult because, like, I could have just said a lot of the Kingdom Hearts games, and I know someone wrote in about that. But I think the problem with the Kingdom Hearts games you run into is that there's a lot of lore, and you kind of have to play all of them to kind of understand any of it, especially because I don't think the first Kingdom Hearts holds up super well, and it's harder to justify telling a new player to maybe play Kingdom Hearts 2 without playing the first one. So that's what it kind of kept me off this list. So then my mind kind of went to The Witcher 3, but same with kind of my argument about Persona 5 for a new player. I think it's a bit daunting to go into The Witcher 3 because of just how much content is in that game, because that's also a 100-hour game. So for a new player, I know that's a big ask. So where I came down on what action RPG I wanted to kind of represent in that category is one that we actually got last year, which is actually a remake. Final Fantasy VII Remake is my answer to this question. Because even though the original game, I'm personally more in line with the first game because I love the turn-based combat that was in the first game. I definitely think that Final Fantasy VII Remake is kind of one of the best action RPGs I've played in the last number of years. The story is fantastic, even though I don't really love kind of some of the filler-ish sections of the story. I do think for the most part the story is really solid in the first remake that came out, but the combat in this game is really, really fun. So I think if you really want like a really solid action RPG that doesn't monopolize your time, that really respects your time, I think, even though again, you've got those filler sections, but there's a lot of that stuff that's optional. So you don't have to, go through it if you don't want to. I think it's just a really solid action RPG, and definitely my pick for an action RPG. Like if you're newer to these types of games and you don't know where to start with action RPGs, I think Final Fantasy VII Remake, along with Mass Effect Legendary Edition, are kind of my two like primary sources of where you should probably start with them.
Oh, nice. The thing is, I did get this game, and I think I told you this before, and I have had one sitting with this game, and I absolutely enjoyed it. I was just in the middle of so many other games to wrap up and finish up. So it's in my head. It's in my hard drive, my PS5 hard drive. It's ready to go. It's just, I gotta finish. I don't know when I'm going to wrap up current games and go to the next one, but that one's been on my mind as well, for sure. So I'll definitely get to that sometime.
All right, Garrett, final pick. What's the final pick?
Okay. Well, you just insulted it, which I mean, not insulted it, but you kind of like had a reasoning behind why you didn't put it in your list. But I think it should be in this list just because of how much fun I've had in this game and just getting lost in the world. And that is Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, and the DLC and everything, the expansions. I think this is one of the best writing in a Western RPG setting I've seen in a while. I do get the sentiment of a lot of content in there. There's a lot of question marks in that map, but I think you can handpick what the ones that were really good as far as side quests and then like the main quest lines versus, oh, here's a treasure hunt or here's a bandit camp or something. There's just a lot of filler in there that you can probably hand select and craft and get out of the way. But I think it's a culmination in Witcher 3 of just, I love the Scandinavian look to it. I love the music behind it. It sets a really good atmosphere. I love Geralt as the character and the agency I had behind him, who to romance, who to be friends and companions with, and the side quests. The side character itself is fantastic as well. I know there's some history behind there, but it didn't really matter to me. Witcher 3 was my first Witcher game in the franchise, and it's still one of my favorite games of all time. I love the crafting in there and the magic behind this game. It's not too much. It's not as much as like I say a JRPG or even like a Fallout game or anything like that. It's a little grounded. And that's what I love about it, is that it does take some effort to do some extra magic or to do some extra crafting in your source. But once you figure out the best way to go after a hunt and a monster, it's the most incredible feeling. And I think that feeling is mutual with, like, let's say a Monster Hunter game or something like that, where you're preparing and then going after it. Lastly, the expansions. Yeah. The expansions are one of the best out there. I think Blood and Wine, I played it on my base PS4, and no joke, it still looked gorgeous to me. Yeah. In that system. So I just say go ahead and stab it. If you're really looking into a good, nice, expanded Western RPG, Witcher 3 is my first pick that I would tell you and to go after. So there you go. Witcher 3 is my pick. It's
official. We stamped it in there. We've added it to the list. Even though I, mentioned that my points about it, I can definitely understand where you're coming from and why you recommend it, Garret. And I know, again, like a lot of people that weren't really into RPGs that did play it for the first time and really enjoyed it. So you're right. I think it definitely deserves a spot on this list. And not only that, but I think it adds some more Western flavor to this list, because I think that you and I definitely slant more towards JRPGs. So I think it was definitely refreshing to have another Western RPG on there. And if there was another one to pick, it would probably be that, because we could go in a number of different directions with action RPGs. Like we could pick, Soulsborne games or roguelikes or something like that. But I just don't think those particular genres are really, good for newer players to the genre. Right. Like I don't think it's necessarily essential for every RPG fan to play a Soulsborne game as like their first 10 RPGs that they play. As much as I think that you should at least experiment with them at some point. Maybe that's like in the 11 to 20 list is where I would maybe put, a game like Bloodborne or Sekiro or something like that. But to top things off, Garret, we've talked about a lot of different RPG subgenres on this list. We've talked about action RPGs. We've talked about turn-based RPGs. We've talked about strategy RPGs. We've talked about Western open world RPGs. We've pretty much covered the gamut of every RPG subgenre except for one big glaring one that that I'm going to represent because of kind of my background. But I do really think that anyone who's new to RPGs should play an MMO at least once. They should play at least one MMO RPG at some point. Especially because who knows? Like, I think most people write off MMOs because a lot of people don't give them a chance, or they feel like the time commitment's a little too much. But the nice thing about MMOs and what people most who are new to MMOs might not know is that a lot of MMOs actually act as, single player experiences for the most part until you get to certain points either in the story or in the leveling process where you have to start, teaming up with people. But for the most part, you're mostly playing, solo, which I think is really good for a person who is newer to the game. Not only that, but I think we don't really have any co-op RPGs on this list either. And we could have gone and added some, like some of the Elder Tales games or the Secret of Mana games. But I feel like Final Fantasy XIV is the game that I would throw in this list. One, because it has an incredible story that is one of the best modern RPG stories in any game. It's definitely up there with The Witcher 3 and Mass Effect and a bunch in those like caliber of RPG stories, combined with a really fun battle system, which I think will be a lot more approachable to new players versus like stuff like World of Warcraft, which I think is aged not as well. Or you've got stuff like New World that just came out, but I know a lot of people have had a tough time with that one. That's a very divisive RPG. So I think all in all, Final Fantasy XIV is definitely the RPG that the MMO that I would recommend to anyone who's new to RPGs. And again, I think it's important to try all of the different, all the major RPG genres. If you're new to RPGs, to kind of, get your feet wet, kind of figure out what style of RPG you like and kind of where you should kind of take your RPG journey from there. And I think you have to. It would be impossible to put a list like this together and not mention an MMO. So I think that Final Fantasy XIV absolutely deserves a spot on this list. It's one of the best modern RPGs in my opinion, and I think it definitely deserves a spot on this list.
Nice. Sounds good, man.
There we go.
I'll see if I'll ever get to it, but it looks really cool. It looks really expansive. And I do like MMOs. It's just the level of commitment in an MMO for me right now, it's not there.
That's why I think like at some point they're probably going to do something like they did what Square Enix just announced at Tokyo Game Show this week for Dragon Quest, because they announced because they did a MMO version of Dragon Quest for Dragon Quest X, and they just announced this week that they're doing an offline version of the game, like a single player version that you can play by yourself. That basically goes through the whole story of Dragon Quest X. So I imagine when they kind of wrap up the story of Endwalker, which kind of completes like the big story they've been telling for 10 years in Final Fantasy XIV, I imagine we're going to get a single player only version of Final Fantasy XIV that comes out at some point. And I think maybe that's where some people like you, Garrett, who maybe are worried about the time commitment, maybe jump into it, because then you don't have to worry about grouping it with other players, and it's probably going to be a little more streamlined than if you played it with other players. So
I think the two biggest hurdles is time commitment, and also just like the need to be with other players and do dungeon raids and stuff like that. It is fun. It is really fun. It just takes a considerable amount of time, and sometimes you're in a clan, you gotta go through it, and it feels like work in a sense. I think you're right though, with like an MMO that has like a really high caliber RPG is it should be played. I think Elder Scrolls Online hits that vein as well. I think it does a very good job at like letting you play on your own and like have a single player experience. And I'm sure Final Fantasy XIV has something like that as well.
It does. There's only very few things where you really have to play with other players. And Elder Scrolls Online was actually kind of my second choice for this slot. And it kind of barely missed the cutoff, because I do think the story in Final Fantasy XIV is much, much stronger. And I definitely think like the story being stronger correlates a lot better with the list we're trying to put together, because a lot of RPGs focus on story. We mostly played them for the story, so I think the story is one of the biggest factors when kind of evaluating where to put these in here. But Elder Scrolls Online is actually a really good pick too, because I think to your point, you can play a lot of it by yourself, and you're going to have a pretty good time with it as well. So there you go. Yeah. So that's our list of 10 games. But Garrett, hit me with some of your honorable mentions if we didn't have any of the crossover ones left that we missed.
All right, so I had a 10 list, and here's the leftover of those 10 games that it was just in my essential RPGs, and that's Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, Dragon Age Origins. I really enjoy that game. I played that in 2019 on the Xbox, and it still plays fantastically and stuff like that.
Somewhere Sean Capri is nodding in approval at that list.
Yeah, Sean's like, yes! And then I actually put in a Vanillaware game because I think they're just a dark horse in the RPG genre. And I put Odin Sphere. What's it pronounced? Liftrasser.
It's like Liftweiser or something like that.
Yeah. So that's a 2D side-scrolling action RPG, and it's just amazing on Vita.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure we're going to mention it later on in future episodes.
We literally have a top 10 PlayStation Vita episode coming next week. So we're probably going to talk about it. So
it's going to be really fun.
Yeah.
So that was left over my 10 list. And here are like some of the games that were in my mind of subgenres that we didn't really speak to, or I think in these lists. And one of them is actually Divinity Original Sin 2. I think that's a pinnacle of its own subgenre of CRPGs. Diablo 3. I think that's a very good, recognized, popular action dungeon crawling game. Slay the Spire is another one that is a card-based roguelite RPG. Severed is another dungeon crawling RPG that's indie. And then I'll put this in here. I know it's not an RPG, but it's a first-person shooter. It's Borderlands 2. I think it has great RPG elements in writing in there.
Yeah, if you wanted to have like a category or game that represented like RPG elements that made their way into other games, but is maybe more approachable for an RPG person than a lot of the stuff we talked about because it is so tied to a genre that they might be more familiar with. I think that actually isn't as bad of a pick that you're kind of making it out to be, Garrett. So.
Yeah. So
there you go. Good choices. As for me, again, I also brought my list of 10, but we did have some crossover with it. So I have a lot fewer picks here, but I'm going to go through some of the genres that I kind of came up with and kind of the games that go along with them. So first off, I think every RPG fan should play an indie RPG at some point. Just like to your point with Severed. The other one that I brought was Undertale, because I know it's a game that brought a lot of people into RPGs. It's a really fantastic turn-based RPG, but also just super unique from like any game that's out there. Like how often do you play a bullet hell game in an RPG? Like it's very bizarre, but also like I love kind of the ability to kind of like forgive the monsters and kind of let them, be spared essentially so they can just go along on their merry way, and how that plays in the story is really interesting as to whether or not you kill all the monsters or save them. I think it's actually a really, really unique game. Another category I had is I think every RPG gamer should play a Final Fantasy game of some kind. And when I say a Final Fantasy game, even though I've mentioned a couple of them on this list already, I mean kind of like the classic style Final Fantasy. And the one I chose was Final Fantasy VI on Super Nintendo for all the reasons we talked about with Chrono Trigger. It's a masterpiece. It's a tour de force. It's a game that holds up all these years later with some excellent writing and some great characters and really fantastic turn-based combat. And then the other category was kind of one that I know you probably don't have a lot of insight into because I know you didn't really play a lot of PS1 games, Garrett. But I felt like the PS1, PS2 era was a really strong era for RPGs. And I think every person who's new to RPGs or wants to know more about RPGs should play a game from that era. And the game I came up with was Chrono Cross, continuing the Chrono story from Chrono Trigger. Obviously, I think that you can play it without playing the first game, but I think you should play Chrono Trigger first, then play Chrono Cross, because I love kind of how the story ties into Chrono Trigger in a lot of really interesting ways. The combat system's completely different from Chrono Trigger, so they feel like two very different experiences. But Chrono Cross for me, I think, is a game that I had to put on this list, especially because as someone who's kind of studied kind of the history of RPGs, like the PS1, PS2 era in particular was just a really strong defining year for RPGs. And definitely I had to pick at least a game from that list to put on here. So there you go. So those are all our games. Again, I also had Pokemon as well as some other stuff you talked about, Garrett, and Persona.
Right.
So we had a little bit of crossover there. But we also put the call out to Twitter to ask for people's lists of RPGs and what they think are some of the most important RPGs that people should play. And we got a lot of suggestions. So first off, I want to say thank you to everyone on Twitter who responded with your RPG choices. And we're going to go through them one by one and talk about them. We're going to start off with Todd Oxtra. And he said, I assume Betrayal at Krondor is on that list. I had to look this one up because I didn't know what this was. What is this one? So this is actually a CRPG that came out. It came out in the early 90s. It essentially came out in 1993 from Sierra, and
goodness,
yeah, it's like you basically like you've got basically your bottom half of your window with kind of your character portraits with kind of their life associated with it, with some large icons on the right hand side, and then you've got basically this gameplay window where you're walking around in kind of like 3D space from town to town or through dungeons. It looks interesting, but it's just one of those things where it's an older game, so I think it is definitely tougher for new players to get into. So I don't know if I would, throw this in the essential RPGs, but at the same time, we just said essential RPGs, and I had mentioned for beginners, but I know that it was an interesting choice from Todd. But I'm sure this is a game that Todd really likes, and I would love to know more about it. Again, I don't know anything about this game. It was
on a floppy disk.
Yeah, of course. It was in 1993, Garrett. This is before CD-ROM existed.
Yeah, wow. And then it got re-released on CD-ROM, but oh wow.
Yeah.
This is a game.
It's certainly a game. So yeah. So there you go. I had to include it in here though, because Todd seemed very adamant about that. Next up, Hobie1K at Hobie1K says, I think Kingdom Hearts 2 is one of the best JRPGs ever made. I think anyone remotely interested in action combat JRPGs should put some time into this game. The downside is having to play 2 other games first to just understand what's going on with Kingdom Hearts. And we talked about it a little bit when I was kind of going through the action RPG category, where I think that, that's the tough thing about Kingdom Hearts is that you kind of have to start with the first one, even though it's you could just skip it and go to 2. Plus, again, some of the other portable games too. There's a lot to the lore in Kingdom Hearts, and you'll have no idea what's going on with the lore if you don't do that first. Which I think it's a tough ask for someone who's new to these games.
Yeah, maybe you could watch a YouTube video that has a summary of like each of the games or whatever to go to Kingdom Hearts 2. Man, I think I took a good stab at Kingdom Hearts a few years back, and I was like 5 hours into the first game. I'm like, no, I'm good. Like this is hard. It's harder to go through. I think if you're really into Disney and Disney themes and that story or whatever, I think totally go for it. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know about this, Hobie1K. I like how a lot of people make fun of Kingdom Hearts too. Like the non-Kingdom Hearts fans just makes fun of the Kingdom Hearts fans so much just throughout all the time. But I understand they're probably really great games.
Yeah, and actually, I will agree with Hobie's point about the combat. I think the combat in Kingdom Hearts is actually really fun. It's just a matter of, I don't think it's enough to carry the experience for someone who's just jumping into this fresh with just this game. I think that's kind of the problem we maybe run into with it. Hobie even points that out himself. He's like, you got to play 2 other games to understand what's going on with the story. So I think that's part of the problem. But I will say there is one game that you can play that is not only fun, but I think actually does a really good job of recalling the Kingdom Hearts story in a really, interesting way that I think actually does a pretty good job of retelling it. And that's Kingdom Hearts Melody of Memories, the Kingdom Hearts rhythm game that came out last year. Because you basically play through all of the different levels with the music from Kingdom Hearts. But at the same time, it's also telling you the story of all the Kingdom Hearts games while you do that with these cinematics. And I think it actually does a really good job of summarizing the story from the first game, as well as some of the spin-off games, as well as everything else you kind of need to know about the story going to what I assume is going to be Kingdom Hearts 4 in a couple of years.
Gosh, there's just so many of these games. I'm glad they're going back to like sequential numbering instead of like splitting off to like a bunch of different things.
358 over 2 days, as an example. Is he getting into fractions there, Garrett?
I'm glad they packaged everything in one. It's like, here's everything all in one package for you to sell. And I'm like, great. I'll go to that and go from there. So
yeah, for sure. All right. Next up, Kevin Ainsworth at the Muffon Man. or he's got a one in
the
there.
Muffin Man.
He asked he says, essential RPGs question mark. I'll try to give a mix of Western and JRPGs and some older / newer ones. So his suggestions are Tales of Symphonia on the GameCube, Persona 5 Royal, Final Fantasy VII the original, not remake, Skyrim, Mass Effect 1 through 3, but particularly 2. We talked about that when we talked about Mass Effect Legendary Edition, and Golden Sun. Also
Golden Sun.
List. Yeah. So Kevin, I think
that's a good list.
You've got a pretty good list here. Yeah. I mean, Tales of Symphonia, I talked about it when we talked about the Tales series. I think it's a pretty good starting point. But I do think the combat hasn't aged as well as I would have hoped to. But the story is still great in Tales of Symphonia. And I mean, the Tales series is always really known for great stories in their games. And Tales of Symphonia is one of the better ones, I think. I just wish the combat got a little bit more modernization. And that's why I think it's a little bit difficult to recommend. And we talked about Persona 5 as far as the length being a problem. Final Fantasy VII with its visuals, the original one. You played it for the first time this year, Garrett.
Yes.
I know that it's probably a little bit harder for probably new people maybe to go back to that game. Would you agree with that?
Yes, very much so. I think it's probably played best on Switch because it is handheld and like it's easier to kind of go through and makes a lot of things like faster pacing, like the battles and everything like that. So I think it's not like if you can ignore the rough polygons, you get used to it after like maybe a couple hours. It's like, all right, I'm here for the story. I'm here for the gameplay. Let's go. But yeah.
Yeah, just go back and play the PS1 version because you can't, because I love the kind of the fast forwarding features, for example, with some of the battles, or even just moving around the map, getting around the map a lot faster, I think really helps. And then there's some, helpful stuff if you're struggling with some of the battles, or if you went into the Temple of the Ancients and didn't level enough before going through in there and being totally screwed over. So at least there's a way to kind of get out of that with kind of the invincibility mode that they offer in kind of the remake. And then Skyrim, we've talked about it before, Garrett. I think Skyrim's probably a good choice too, but
it's a great choice.
I think that's probably in like the 11 to 20 range as far as where I would.
It would be number 11 for me. It's like I can't believe I didn't put it in here, but I already put a Bethesda game and like some Western RPGs. But Skyrim is a very good choice. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a few months, which I'm very excited to talk about that. And then Mass Effect we talked about before, and then Golden Sun. I know you haven't played it, Garrett, but I think it's like both Golden Sun and Golden Sun: The Lost Age are two incredible turn-based JRPGs, and I think they're a great start for people too who are maybe newer to the genre. They do some interesting things too with some psychic powers as well, like moving different objects around and stuff like that. But I'm very excited to talk about Golden Sun because we're probably going to talk about that at some point in the future. And at some point, when
I eventually force you to play it, it's going to be great.
It's and now you just pick number 27 on my backlog list, probably.
I mean, I just feel like I'm continually adding to it every time we do this show together.
Yeah.
Which is, it's lovely. All right, next up, Leah Jure says, Persona 5 and Final Fantasy X are the top of my list, which are pretty good picks. I think Final Fantasy X of the PS2 era is definitely one of the more approachable ones too. It was actually one I was thinking about putting in there rather than Chrono Cross, but I also didn't want half my list to be Final Fantasy games, and I wanted to have a little more variety in there. Plus, I kind of prefer 9 over 10. So even from that era, that's the one I'd pick up over 10. But 10 I think is not a bad choice, especially if you've got a Switch. I think that the Switch re-release actually plays pretty well. And then Persona 5, of course, masterpiece game. But again, the time commitment's maybe tough ask for a new player, but it's definitely a game that is appearing on quite a few of these lists, and it's not going to be the last time we talk about it. So it's definitely a good pick as well.
Final Fantasy X to me, I wish I just need to go back to it. I have it on Vita. I played it for like maybe 10 hours or something like that, and I just dropped it. I just like was no longer interested into it. I think the biggest hurdle for me with that one is the sports game.
Oh, Blitzball?
Blitzball is just ridiculous to me. It's like, why do you need me to learn this obtuse sports game in an RPG? I'll never understand.
Yeah, why was it this big mandatory sequence in the game? Like, what do you do? Like, why is this even here? Yeah.
It's literally a 2-hour tutorial or something like that. It's like, all right, you're going to go to the left and to the right into this phase. And I'm like, oh, no, don't. Please stop. I'm sure it's a great game overall. It's just that sports game really just deterred me away.
Yeah.
With that.
Yeah, it'd be different if it was like a
Anyways.
side thing. Then I don't think it would be so
Yes.
bad. But I think it being part of the story, I think kind of hurts it a little bit. So there you go. Next up, Ryan Craig at Mathman101024. I can't talk today.
Yes.
Says Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, which of course were 2 games on my list. But he also said Dragon Warrior / Quest. I'm guessing he means the NES game, the very first one.
Yes, the original, yeah.
But he also said Dragon Quest 11S, which I think is a good pick too. Especially because I think the new version has a lot of more modern refinements. The reason I didn't consider this one for my list is actually the same reason as Persona 5, because this one is probably one of the second longest JRPG, modern JRPGs that you can play today. So I definitely think it's another big time investment, and I think it's a lot to ask for the players. But at the same time, it's like the oldest game in the Dragon Quest series. Like, it basically takes place before all the other games. Like, it's a big prequel to every other Dragon Quest game. So, I mean, you don't need to know about any of the other Dragon Quest games to kind of know about them, even though the stories, unlike Final Fantasy, they do kind of carry over a little bit more. Like, the story, you have to play some of the other games to kind of understand the story a bit. But this one, you don't even care about that for the most part. I think it's just fun on its own. But yeah, it's a little bit tougher to get into. But I don't think we've ever talked about Dragon Quest 11 on the show, Garrett, right? Have you played it?
Not much. I played just a little bit on Xbox, but not too much. The impressions I get from Dragon Quest 11 in general is the pacing of it. It's like, it's really good. I heard it's just one of the top like JRPG mechanically. It's just, it drags way too long. And I know Ryan, he's a huge Dragon Quest person. He is a Dragon Quest expert, and he'll go through all of them. So I'm not surprised to see a couple of those Dragon Quest games in there. I particularly enjoyed the Dragon Quest Builder games. I think those are pretty good RPG element around non-RPG games. I think they did a fantastic job with those, and I really do need to go into the Dragon Quest. I've dabbled in a few of them. I've never finished one of them though. Throughout
they're all very long, so it's like
they're very long. Yes,
that's a problem you run into regardless of what Dragon Quest you play. Even the NES ones are long, so it's like it's harder to kind of go back to a lot of those older titles. But Dragon Quest 8 in particular, I remember really loving that one on PlayStation 2, and that's another like really solid PlayStation 2 title. If you were going to look at that era of gaming as well, kind of like what I was talking about with Chrono Cross. But then the next two that we got were two pretty long lists of 10 games on their own.
Yeah.
So we're to start with Mike at Blaze Knight 0923. And we kind of alluded to this one when talking about one that you came up with before, but we'll read through his list in full. So Breath of Fire 3, Valkyria Chronicles 4, Fire Emblem 3 Houses, Chrono Trigger, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. Garrett, shout out to you. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. The first time someone's mentioned a Pokemon game here, which I'm actually kind of surprised about. Mass Effect 2, Final Fantasy 11, The Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim, and Ogre Battle 64, Person of Lordly Caliber. I'm actually amazed just to see an N64 game on here in particular, because, I mean, the N64, very devoid of RPGs. It was that or Quest 64, and that was pretty much it as far as RPGs on that console. And Quest 64, don't go back and play that game. That game sucks. But Ogre Battle is actually not a bad game. But I'm just kind of surprised to see it here. I'm also surprised to see Final Fantasy 11, another MMO on this list. Because I do think that one is definitely harder to go back to for new players, especially because like it was a game, it was an MMO that came out before World of Warcraft. So you actually had to, in order to perform any action in the game, you had to go in this like sub menu upon sub menu upon sub menu to execute like basic attacks or abilities, or you couldn't assign abilities to buttons in that game. So it was interesting and very tough to navigate. But I played it a ton because it was actually the first MMO I really got into. But as far as an MMO suggestion, probably not the place you want to start. But I do think it's a solid game. But other than that, though, I actually like Blaze Knight's list. I think it's pretty good. Again, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, I like those games. I think they're fun.
A very diverse list. Pokemon Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire is my second choice, and it's my favorite out of the franchise. I just think Heart Gold, Soul Silver would be better for a beginning player. It has probably a little bit more content and stuff like that.
And it's just like Valkyria, 3 Houses as well, where like we talked about that before, where I think it's, even though it's on his list and I think it's an okay place to start, I do think it's a little bit overwhelming. But go ahead with Valkyria Chronicles 4, Garrett.
Valkyria Chronicles 4, I thought about a lot too as one of my XCOM-like games, and that's a very solid one, and that one's on Switch as well, and it's really, really good.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is a very good list.
Also, I'd have to shout out to the original Valkyria Chronicles, which is also on Switch, and also an incredible game. Like, it was incredible when it came out on PS3, and it still plays really well. So I think that those are pretty solid picks. So yeah, I think Blade Sight's list is actually closer to our list than I think I was expecting before kind of reading it too, because he also had Mass Effect in here, Mario plus Rabbids, Chrono Trigger. So there's a lot of overlap. But then this one was an interesting list that I thought was interesting, because a lot of Western RPGs from Seamus McIsaac, at Famous Seamus, the most famous of all the Seamuses. He says Persona 5 Royal or Persona 4 Golden or Persona 3 FES. That's all one suggestion.
Okay, so Persona, yeah.
So Persona. Fire Emblem Awakening or Three Houses, which we kind of touched on so many times already. Undertale, which I kind of agree with. Nier Automata, The Witcher 3, Mass Effect. He just says Mass Effect. I'm just assuming the trilogy when he says that. Fallout New Vegas, which of course he agrees with you on that. Disco Elysium, The Outer Worlds, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, and then honorable mention, any Pokemon game, the player's choice. Garrett, what do you think about this list?
It's a great list. It's a mix of like new and old, a little bit leaning towards Western RPGs, which I like. I love the inclusion of Disco Elysium in there, The Outer Worlds, like more of these recent games, which I agree with Seamus that it's probably easier to get into and probably enjoy more time as a non-RPG person just getting into the genre. This is a very good list to start out with. So. Yeah, it's very nice. Especially
with a game like Disco Elysium, where I didn't think to put this on here, but I think it makes sense in the sense that it's a CRPG and it's a modern CRPG, so it's probably like one of the easier to get into CRPGs than even probably something like Divinity, which I think has its own little bit of cumbersomeness to it, to the experience that makes it harder for new players. So maybe Disco Elysium, keeping it simple might be a better option. Outer Worlds is an interesting choice because it kind of takes the idea of Fallout New Vegas, but then kind of puts it into space and then adds some interesting elements to it. And of course, it's the same developer who did Fallout New Vegas back in the day. But then it had its own set of problems too, regardless of like depending on what console you played it on too. So it's an interesting selection for this list. But then he also had Fallout New Vegas on here as well, which kind of agrees to what you talked about. So yeah, a lot of the stuff that we talked about here already. The one I will point to as well, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, is the one I probably disagree with because even though it is one of my top 5 favorite games of all time, the reason I didn't suggest Knights of the Republic is it's very hard to go back to from the gameplay and the graphics perspective. The story is incredible. It's definitely, I think it's easily one of the best Star Wars stories across any medium. But I think that the gameplay and the visuals really kill it for any new player to that game. I know, like the perfect example I have for that is when Sean played it for the first time earlier this year, and he just was having a rough time playing it. And anyone in his chat who was new to the game also was just like, what the heck are you playing? Why are you doing this to yourself? And I think the remake, I think, is going to make it a little bit easier for new people to get into it. In fact, I actually just did a episode of The Crossroads 2 weeks ago by the time you're listening to this, all about Knights of the Republic, because I didn't put it at the top of my list for original Xbox games for that reason, because we had kind of playability factor into kind of my design for that list. And I do think the gameplay doesn't hold up over time, but I think the story is incredible for that game and it's definitely worth playing just for that. But for a new player, probably not where you want to start with RPGs. So
I'll speak with Nier Automata. That is it's a fantastic RPG. I played through only like a couple of the playthroughs in there. I think it's more of an obtuse game, but it has a very nice style with it. I don't know if I would say this is a great entry for a non-RPG. I think it depends on the taste. It depends on what you like. If you do like the Japanese weirdness and then like action type of style games, Nier Automata is probably a great pick for you. And the music's fantastic as well.
Especially if you like games like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta or Ninja Gaiden. Yeah, I think it's a perfect game that kind of fits into that slot and kind of is an entryway to RPGs for sure. And then the newest Nier game, Nier Replicant, I think is a little bit even more obtuse than Near Automata.
Right.
So I think it's even harder to get into for new people. But yeah, I think that was a fantastic selection of choices from our listeners. So I want to say again, huge thank you to everyone who wrote in this week with your lists. It was really fun going through them, and I thought I had a really good time this episode. Putting together our de facto list of games that anyone who's new to RPGs should play. I think definitely for anyone out there who's maybe listening to this show who's newer to RPGs, I hope we gave you a great selection of games to go check out and play. Hopefully.
Yep.
Anyways.
Definitely.
But before we go, Garrett, plugs, go.
You can follow me at Twitter at Blind Explosion, and I'm also a co-host to the Nintendo Shack, part of the Play Some Video Games Podcast Network. You can catch us mostly on Thursday nights, sometimes Friday. It just depends on the week now. And you can support them over at patreon.com/PSVG.
Very nice, my friend. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. Of course, it is video game review season, so I'm busy on reviews. By the time you're listening to this, our Far Cry 6 review will be live, so you can go check out my review of that. Our Metroid Dread review will be available next week, so you can check out my review on that. And I'm working on all kinds of other stuff, including RPG reviews that you're going to see later this month. So definitely stay tuned to our channel for that. Also, if you want to see our beautiful faces every week, youtube.com/YumiCapri. Go watch the video version there, subscribe, all that stuff. We're also on podcast services around the globe. So for Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been level 20 of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.
The RPG Cave's mana is fueled by patrons over at patreon.com/YumiCapri. And I want to say thanks to each and every one of our Patreon supporters for all of your support throughout the years, as well as supporting our independent content. And let's start by thanking our premium producers, Dallas Ford, Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team, and Jonathan Brown. You can find his content over at youtube.com/PM Entertainment. Our platinum producers, Robbie Bobby Mailer and Trucker Sloth, and our gold members, Argo, Brendan Myers, Dallas Robbins, Emily O'Kelly, Heather Boney, James Johnson, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Benji Kong, Marcus O'Neill, RJ Kern, Dano, Skinny Matt, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, Foolish Fuji, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support.